On the 13th of July 2010, Brad Callahan rang the New Zealand police to report that his ex-partner hadn't turned up to collect their little boy. They had a custody agreement in place, and she was due to collect him the day prior, but she never showed up and he hadn't been able to reach her. It took 3 more months for Carmen to be found, and even longer for the horrific truth about what happened to her to come to light. Carmen Thomas was born on the 30th of October 1977 in a small town east of Johannesburg in South Africa. When Carmen was 10, her father passed away. A couple of years later, her mother Teresa decided to move the family back to her hometown in the United Kingdom. Carmen was a bright and bubbly girl. She made friends easily and loved going to school. She excelled at singing and dancing and played a variety of sports. When Carmen was just 23 years old, she was diagnosed with bowel cancer. At the time, there was a very low survival rate for this type of cancer, but Carmen was determined to overcome the odds. She underwent chemotherapy at the same time as completing a marketing degree. By the time she had finished treatment, she was nearing the end of her studies, which gave her 2 reasons to celebrate. After graduation, Carmen moved to London, filled with hope and anticipation of a bright future. And maybe she would have had it, if it wasn't for a chance meeting with Brad Callahan. Brad was a civil engineer from New Zealand. He was born in 1978 and raised in Whakatane. He graduated from the University of Auckland in 2001, and like many young Kiwis, he was excited about the prospect of his big OE. When he graduated, he moved to Australia, and a few months later, he took an even bigger leap and headed off to the UK. It was 2004 when Carmen and Brad met at a pub on a night out in London. They hit it off right away. Friends would later say she was the yin to his yang. Brad was filled with the energy and invincibility of his youth, while Carmen was mature beyond her years thanks to her experiences with cancer. Whatever it was that drew them together, it clearly had staying power. Within a year of meeting, Carmen and Brad found out they were pregnant. According to friends of the couple, they had a typical relationship with its ups and downs. But those same friends also recall an underlying volatility to their downs. There were screaming matches, threats, and periods where they were broken up and then back together again. In March 2005, Brad and Carmen welcomed a son into the world. They moved into a flat, determined to work things out for the good of their child. But by the time their son was a toddler, it was clear there was no love left to hang on to, and they decided to separate. Carmen stayed in London with their child while Brad returned to New Zealand. This was another pivotal moment in Carmen's story. Almost as soon as Brad left, Carmen decided it was in their son's best interests to have both parents in his life. A few months later, she packed up her life, kissed her family goodbye, and followed Brad to Auckland. For many of Carmen's loved ones, this was the last time they would ever see her. For a while at least, it seems that Carmen and Brad found a way to co-parent their son without letting their personal issues come between them. They agreed on a custody arrangement which saw them split equal 50-50 care of their son, and they lived in houses which were just 2.5 kilometres apart, so they were always available to step in when needed. Carmen lived on her own while Brad lived with his new partner, who was also pregnant with his second child. According to those who knew them both, Brad was a hands-on dad and Carmen was a devoted and affectionate mother. But the volatility they had struggled with from the early stages of their relationship was still there, bubbling away underneath the surface. By mid-2010, the relationship between Carmen and Brad was at a breaking point. Carmen told her boss she had been receiving threatening text messages from Brad, and he encouraged her to go to the police. She did, and for a while the messages seemed to stop. But they still had to see each other when they exchanged their son, although the meetings were short and they didn't say much to each other. Then, on the 13th of July 2010, Brad rang the police to say Carmen hadn't showed up for her scheduled custody exchange. Carmen was known for being punctual and reliable, especially when it came to her son, so not showing up for the handover immediately raised red flags. As soon as the report came across the lead investigator's desk, he sensed that something about the circumstances of Carmen's disappearance wasn't adding up. She had been reported missing on the 13th of July, but the last confirmed sighting of her was nearly 2 weeks earlier, on the 27th of June, when she visited a supermarket in Green Lane. When Brad was asked why it took him so long to report Carmen missing, he stated that he hadn't been too worried when he didn't hear from her because they had a shared custody agreement and they only spoke when it related to their son anyway. But even this part of the story didn't make sense. See, Carmen would often call and chat to her son when he was staying with his dad, which made it doubly strange that Brad hadn't thought anything was off when she went quiet for 2 whole weeks. During one of Brad's early conversations with the police, he told them that Carmen had been unwell the last time he saw her in late June, when she dropped their son off. The police contacted hospitals and health services across the country to establish if she had presented to any emergency departments or doctors, but there was no record of a Carmen Thomas at any of them. As word of Carmen's disappearance broke the national news, the officer in charge of the investigation provided a statement to the media, urging anyone with information to contact the police. She was described as 5 foot 7 inches tall, medium to heavy build, with brown hair and wearing 2 sets of earrings. Further updates from the police included information that Carmen's phone had been active until about a week after she was last seen. Her bank account had not been accessed at all during the time she was missing. Within days of the initial report of Carmen's disappearance, the police announced a task force had been set up to look into her whereabouts. The investigation was named Operation Keppel and involved police resources from across the country. That task force discovered that Carmen had been working as an escort at a gentleman's club in East Auckland. There was a lot of discussion about whether she had met with foul play from a troublesome client, although the chances of this were considered slim. But her boss at the club did have some additional insights to offer. He told officers that Carmen had told him she was receiving threatening text messages from an old manager at another escort agency she used to work for. Quote, "They weren't death threats, but they were threats towards her. When they started to include her son, she went to police. She mentioned that they knew where he went to school. After that, she went to police. She stood in my doorway, shaking and crying. I'd say she was pretty terrified about it all." End quote. When Brad was asked about Carmen's work as an escort, he told investigators he knew what she did for work, but she had recently given it up at his request, especially after she started to feel unsafe at work. The threatening text messages were a strong lead, but when police spoke to the woman who had sent the messages, they discovered the pair had a falling out over unexpected charges on the manager's work laptop. Carmen had downloaded some movies for her son, which cost more than she had said, and she was chasing Carmen to repay the money. It appeared the messages had nothing to do with Carmen's disappearance. It was another frustrating dead end. A few days later, the police got a significant break in the case. In a strange turn of events, Carmen's Nissan Pulsar vehicle with license plate ATS 209 had been reported abandoned to the police on the 5th of July in Hamilton, more than 120 kilometres away from Carmen's home. The vehicle didn't have any significance to the police until Carmen was reported missing on the 13th of July. When the connection between Carmen and the vehicle was made, it was towed to a secure compound. Inside the car was cash, cards, and personal items belonging to Carmen. There was no sign of her or any indication as to where she was, but her vehicle did show the presence of blood, which was deeply concerning to investigators. It's not hard to imagine that the weeks following Carmen going missing were extremely painful for her family. Her mother lived in the UK and had travelled to New Zealand immediately after learning Carmen had disappeared, but her extended family was spread far and wide around the globe. Most kept up to date with developments via a Facebook page, which was set up to draw attention to the case and post updates about the investigation. On the 15th of August, the page posted the most devastating update so far. Earlier that day, the police revealed in a press conference that they were treating the case as a murder investigation due to the amount of blood found in Carmen's car. Further updates stated that the task force were looking for CCTV footage from around the area where Carmen lived, and they were also looking for a recycling bin which was missing from her home. By the end of the month, online commentary centered around a theory that Carmen had been murdered, dismembered, weighed down with concrete, and buried in the Hunua Ranges, south of Auckland. These rumours were horrific for Carmen's loved ones to read or even consider, but tragically, they were not far from the truth. But before that truth could come out, there was a lot of ground to cover. The task force didn't make many public statements about the case, but given that missing women and murders are thankfully infrequent in New Zealand, there was plenty of coverage of the case in the media and online. On the 20th of September, reporters caught wind of a search of an Auckland building site associated with Brad's employer. This was the first strong indication that Brad might be more involved in Carmen's disappearance than he had let on. Up until then, Brad had been outspoken about his grief, and in interviews he stated that their son missed his mum and that he wasn't sure what to tell him about why she wasn't around anymore. In late July, the police asked him to be a family representative at a press conference appealing for information from the public on Carmen's disappearance. He agreed to help in any way that he could. The Facebook pages about Carmen's disappearance contained hundreds of messages of sympathy and support for Brad and their son. But when that search of his worksite went public, everything changed. The very next day, the task force announced that Brad had been charged with murder. Over the next few days, they announced they had seized a boat during a search at a property belonging to one of Brad's friends in East Auckland, and that they had searched Brad's home in Remuera. The news of Brad's arrest and the searches came as a shock to the nation, not only because Brad had been considered so genuine in his grief, but also because the police announced they had not found Carmen. Brad had been charged based on evidence from Carmen's vehicle and searches of her flat, which meant Carmen was still missing. Throughout his time in police custody, Brad refused to give a statement to investigators. They told him they knew Carmen was dead and they knew what happened. All they wanted from him was the location of her body. Here is a timeline of how investigators believe the murder went down. At around 8:30 a.m. on the 29th of June, Brad visited Carmen at her flat in Remuera. According to news reports, her landlady heard a scream and whimpering noises, and when she saw Brad leaving the flat, he had blood on his clothes. She asked him about the blood, and he said Carmen had been sick and had vomited blood on him, but she was asleep now and there was no need to worry. But investigators believe that by then Carmen was already dead at the hands of her ex-partner and the father of her child. But without Carmen's body, there was no way of knowing how he had killed her or what he had done to her after. Brad left Carmen's flat and drove to a local supermarket where he met a friend. They bought cleaning supplies and rubbish bags before returning to Carmen's flat and washing away the evidence of her murder. Brad then concealed the bloody cleaning supplies and Carmen's body inside a council wheelie bin. He put the bin in the back of his car, and over the coming days, he used a meat cleaver to dismember her body, bit by bit, in order to make it easier to dispose of her remains. He stored the 8 separate pieces of Carmen in plastic bags and a fish bin. The day after the murder, Brad sent messages from Carmen's phone to make it seem like she was still alive. He also managed to convince a friend who owned a boat to help him get rid of Carmen's remains. By then, he had put the 8 separate pieces of her body into plastic containers, which he filled with concrete. He planned to drop these off the side of his friend's boat. However, when the body parts were loaded and ready to go, the friend backed out of the plan. Brad was forced to come up with a plan B. That plan was to bury the plastic containers in the Waitakere Ranges. The Waitakere Ranges are a mountainous area located on the western side of Auckland in New Zealand's North Island. They occupy approximately 160 square kilometres or 62 miles of rugged terrain, lush native rainforests and stunning coastlines. Although there are many safe walking tracks in the ranges, much of the area is unreachable by car or even on foot. Brad believed this inaccessibility would make the ranges an ideal location to hide what he had done. He wasn't the first, and he certainly wasn't the last, to use this beautiful area for such sinister purposes. Grace Millane's killer also used the Waitakere Ranges to dispose of her body. On the 7th of July, Brad drove to the mountains and buried the dismembered remains of Carmen Thomas. The next day, he dumped Carmen's car in Hamilton. Then Brad went back to life as usual. He continued to go to work, he slept with his partner, and they discussed their unborn child's future, and he put his son to bed every night, knowing what he had done to the child's mother. 10 days after the murder, Brad took their son to Carmen's flat under the pretense of looking for her when she hadn't showed up for their custody exchange. Then he reported her missing, played his role as the grieving ex-partner, and convinced everyone he was a victim, all the while knowing exactly what had happened to Carmen. Brad never gave up the location that he had dumped Carmen's body, and it's unclear how investigators identified a search location. But either way, on the 1st of October, Carmen's body was found partially buried in the Waitakere Ranges. The following day, after the area around her remains was exhumed, her remains were transported by hearse to be forensically examined. The autopsy revealed Carmen had died from repeated blows to the head with her son's baseball bat. Her cause of death was a severe skull fracture behind her right ear. This impact caused such severe damage to her brainstem that it killed her. On the 12th of October, Brad Callahan appeared at the Auckland District Court via video link. He pleaded not guilty and was remanded in custody until February 2012, when his trial was set to begin. He was denied bail. The day after this appearance, Carmen was farewelled in a heartfelt ceremony held at a church in Green Lane. The case was back in the headlines in November 2011, when it was announced that Brad had changed his plea from not guilty to guilty. He also pleaded guilty to attempting to pervert or obstruct the course of justice. The change in plea meant Carmen's family would not have to sit through a trial and hear every explicit detail about what Brad had done to her. In March 2012, during Brad's sentencing hearing, Carmen's mother Teresa provided a devastating victim impact statement. She said she feels completely and utterly destroyed by what happened to her daughter. Her heart is broken and her world shattered, and she cannot sleep for more than a couple of hours at night because her nightmares are too great. Teresa said that before Carmen's death, she and her daughter had been trying to bond again after being separated by their differences. The guilt that she hadn't been able to repair that relationship, quote, eats at me every day. Ultimately, Brad was sentenced to life in prison for murder, with a minimum non-parole period of 13 years and 8 months. He was sentenced to 6 years for perverting the course of justice. Brad appeared in front of the parole board for the first time in 2024. His lawyer indicated he was not seeking parole, as he wanted to stay in prison for another 6 months to complete rehabilitation and reintegration programs. However, the lawyer also indicated that Brad would be seeking parole at the next opportunity. He had a safety plan, accommodation, and employment organised, as well as a strong support network to help him adjust to life outside prison. He had also attended 20 one-on-one sessions with a psychologist to address the root cause of his action. When Brad was asked directly about these sessions, he responded, quote, "We obviously went over my offending in detail, especially the lead up to my offending and everything after the murder itself, when I obviously went on a very extensive, tried to cover up my crime. We went over a lot. She pulled up a lot of things she thought I needed to work on. It was very intense and extensive and confronting. I felt like it was very effective." End quote. Despite Brad not applying for parole at the time, he was given the opportunity to speak about Carmen's murder. He said he had a volcano of emotions and that he meant no disrespect when he cut her body into 8 pieces, entombed her in concrete, and dumped her in the Waitakere Ranges. When he was asked why he killed Carmen, he replied, quote, "I killed Carmen because I reacted to something she told me that I should never have reacted to. In a state of rage, I snapped. Like a volcano of emotions, I hit her 8 times in the head." End quote. According to Brad, he had visited Carmen to talk about their son being bullied at school, but instead, she told him that he was not the boy's father. Quote, "My son was my world. He was my number one priority, and just the thought that he wasn't mine brought up a lot of suppressed emotions." End quote. But when the judge asked why Brad had taken such extreme measures to cover up what he had done, his answer fell flat. He said he had panicked, but the judge rightfully pointed out that Carmen's dismemberment and the disposal of her remains had taken days, not hours. The judge said, quote, "Those are not the actions of a panicked person. They were actually a carefully planned attempt to avoid responsibility. What you did was not the actions of a panicked person. Dismembering her body was an extraordinary thing to do. The refusal to accept responsibility, the persistent attempt to involve other people in your deception was extraordinary." End quote. Brad tried to stick to the panicked defense, and he added that he had no intention of dismembering Carmen. He had initially put her in a wheelie bin and tried to bury her, but he called it a failed attempt. Then he said, quote, "I was becoming desperate. I thought of dismembering her. I know this sounds callous, but it was never meant to disrespect her. From my point of view, it was merely a means to an end in trying to dispose of a body." I hope none of you are familiar with dismembering a body, but it is no small feat. It takes time, it is messy, and undoubtedly extremely disturbing. But according to Brad, it was merely a means to an end. He went on to say, quote, "My intention was to make it easy to transport, to put on a boat. I didn't have some kind of vicious intent to hurt her even further, even though I did. I was just desperate. I had Carmen in a wheelie bin in the boot of my car, and I was so desperate. I know how horrendous and horrible it is. At the time, I was extremely selfish. I wasn't thinking about Carmen or her family or the consequences. I was only thinking of myself." End quote. Those might be the only true words we've ever actually heard from Brad Callahan. The judge called Brad's explanation of his motives leading up to the murder and his actions after selfish. He criticized Brad for his refusal to accept full responsibility and told him that there was more work to be done in gaining a deeper understanding of his offending. Brad replied, "I'm so terribly sorry. I can't do anything more than say I'm sorry. I know that nothing can bring back their daughter. I am so, so sorry from the bottom of my heart for what I have done to them." End quote. There's no doubt that Brad's comments during this parole hearing were disturbing, and for that reason, Brad's lawyers attempted to have the parole proceedings and his statements suppressed by the court, but the judge rejected this request. In his ruling, he commented, quote, "There is a high level of legitimate public interest. We therefore see no reason why his responses should be suppressed. The application is refused." End quote. Brad will be eligible to apply for parole again in June 2025. Carmen and Brad's son has been referred to as Jack in court proceedings, but his true identity is permanently suppressed. He is now under the care of Carmen's mother and lives under an assumed identity. Brad's partner Tanith gave birth to their son in the September, a few days after he was charged with murder. She stood by Brad during his court proceedings and has visited him during his time in custody. If Brad is released on parole in 2025, his son will be 15 years old. The final words of this story belong to Carmen. She is remembered as a fun-loving woman who was never concerned with consequences and enjoyed pushing the boundary. She loved to travel, but more than anything she loved her son. Her friends described her as like a lioness protecting her cub.